Abuse has been defined as the cruel and inhuman treatment of another person. And many times we confuse abuse with violence. But is abuse and violence the same thing? We are going to kick off a series of conversations based on abuse and violence on the show, and we hope that you can keep up with us, but we get straight into it with a heart-to-heart with Dr. Chris Hart on the psychology of abuse next. Hello and welcome to Sheila Lives Out Loud. It's always a great pleasure to have you on this channel. My name is Sheila Mwanyega, and remember as always to hit subscribe to this channel and click on notifications so you never miss an episode. And we are at the beautiful Westwood Hotel, all set to live out loud with Dr. Chris Hart. Hey doctor, how are you doing?
Good, thank you.
It's
Good
great
be
to
here.
see you. Then again, you're always on time and you always come through like the army that you are.
Thank you
Then again,
kindly.
you did serve in the army, did you?
I was a cadet.
Well, that you go.
Long time ago.
Well, it explains it. Once a cadet, always a cadet.
Yep.
But we are all set to have a heart-to-heart with you, and I'm so glad that you always make the time to be here to talk about love and matters relationship. And it's all about abuse and violence. We're kicking off this conversation. We'll be talking about deeply disturbing things that are happening within homes, within families, within the country, really. And so it behooves us to begin by understanding abuse and violence, one and the same
Right.
thing or two different things.
Well, they overlap. I mean, violence is a part of abuse, if you like. Abuse is much wider. And the thing to bear in mind, first of all, is that we're all capable of violence. I mean, people sort of talk about it as a sort of moral issue, as if we shouldn't be violent. Of course, that is true, but the reality is, if you push anybody hard enough, they will get their fists out, won't they?
Right.
And society actually admires that in certain circumstances, doesn't it? I mean, the man who is defending his family in a row on the street, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So you can't just simply say violence is wrong, and you can't say all abuse is violence. Now, violence in the wrong context is dreadful.
Is when there's a problem.
And abuse is much, much wider. I mean, everybody thinks of violence as literally fists and weapons and things like that. But it's almost worse when there are no fists and no weapons. Because, for example, if someone is physically attacking you, probably it's going to cross your mind that this relationship should be over.
Exactly.
But if they're being very subtle and somehow manipulating you in a way that's almost indetectable, but inexorably
logical, really.
then you probably don't notice it happening until it's too late. Years may have gone by.
Okay.
So in fact, you know, the subtler forms of abuse can
Are
be
more
just as bad,
insidious,
if not
yes.
worse, than
Exactly.
violence.
Okay. Understanding abuse and just knowing that there are evil things and very quiet, deep, disturbing psychological shifts that can be happening in a relationship, I begin to think, how soon can you notice that someone's got the kind of behavior that is not good for you, that you
Right.
will not be safe with this person? How can you identify it? And when should you be able to identify it?
Right. I mean, the problem is this. A lot of people who become abusers are actually totally charming when you first meet them. They are excellent manipulators. So when they take you out on a date, they're in manipulation style. You know, they are being wonderful, they're being romantic, they're being attentive and all the rest of it. So the chances of you spotting them on first meeting
Right.
are a bit slim. In fact, you probably think they're a bit too good to be true, and that might be your first red flag. You know, for example, a normal person, male or female, incidentally, it's worth saying that abusers are equal opportunity.
It goes both ways.
100% 50-50.
Yeah.
But the first red flag is probably that this person's too good to be true. They're just too charming, too attentive, too friendly, and you think, hang about, normal people are a bit nervous in this situation. When people go into posh restaurants, they're supposed to be just a bit ill at ease.
Yeah.
And when they meet this charming person for the first time, they're a bit, you know. So if somebody's not like that, that should be your first warning. But then the real warnings come with for example, how they treat other people.
Right.
They're being so nice to you, but they're short to the waiter.
Yes.
And you think, hang about, that wasn't quite right.
Who does that?
Yeah,
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So if you begin to see things like that, you should have a question mark. As you start to talk with them, you start asking questions about their background and their education and their childhood and what they do for a living and their interests. And you'll begin to spot a few more signs. You know, a collection of AK-47s would be a dead giveaway.
It's just like, duh.
Yes.
These are
But you-
my babies.
I mean, I'm joking, but you understand.
But I do get it, yes.
You know, if you start seeing that there's something a little bit odd, I mean, for example, a loner, somebody who just doesn't seem to have a relationship history, describes spending the weekend doing odd things, cataloguing their DVD collection, you know, and setting it out by colour code or something.
Right.
These are not normal behaviours. And you start picking up a few of those, you've got another red flag. And of course, as the time goes on, it'll be how they treat you.
Yeah.
And if you begin to notice that they are a bit insecure with you, they start accusing you of looking at the others.
Who's that? Why are you looking at that
Yeah.
person?
Yeah.
Do you know this person? Why are you standing so close to them?
Start picking stuff like that up,
Yeah.
and you're beginning to wonder. You might start to notice some grandiose behavior. You know, they think an awful lot of themselves. There's a big ego there. You might start to notice some irrational mood changes, some anger. You start seeing things like that, big red flag. Now, the big point about saying all this is that if you get into a relationship which becomes abusive and you're in it for years, it can be extraordinarily difficult to disentangle yourself.
Yeah.
It's not difficult after one or two dates. So you should play incredibly safe. In other words, you see something that is potentially a bit weird.
Yeah.
Don't think twice.
Okay. I can't help but think of a friend who met somebody, and right from the get-go, it was, from the man, it was, this was what I want, this is where you fit in with my life, and this is it. And if you can't, well, you do know I'm an eligible bachelor. Look at me.
Oh, yeah,
Look
lovely.
I mean, really, it was insane. But
Glorious.
that right there was an indicator of somebody who would later on
Yeah.
manifest all kinds of
Almost
crazy.
certainly. The other sign that's a real giveaway is that they go too fast. You know, on the first date, they're saying, I love you. Ordinary people don't do that.
I'm not
you
even
know?
sure I like you on the first date. So.
And on the first 2 or 3 dates, they're starting to talk about marriage and children, and you're thinking, I mean, yes, you can get all starry-eyed if you like. No, you
Yes, but
shouldn't.
no.
That is not
I know I'm
normal.
good, but I'm not
No,
that
you're
good.
not that good. So seriously, if you
Yeah.
see somebody going much too fast, much too confident, much too self-assured, much too romantic,
Yeah.
I know those all sound like positives.
Yeah, because,
They're
you
not.
know, we've read the storybooks and it's supposed to fall in place, and then those Mexican things
Yeah.
where everybody's Alejandro and Lisa and
Yes,
happily ever
quite.
after by episode 13. And so we all begin to think that it should all fall in place in that way, but then it doesn't.
doesn't.
Okay, so
Real
early-
people are a bit nervous, a bit anxious, they take a bit too long. You understand what I'm saying?
yeah, I do.
And the
It-
reverse of
it's-
that is a dead giveaway.
Okay. Now, in understanding that abuse and violence walk hand in hand, both of them are the best of friends, if not identical twins in certain instances, I'm going to take our conversation to the point where it has to have had a genesis. Some people are taught to be abusive. Some people learn to be violent. And then there's a small category of people where there's just psychological issues that have played out in them that are way beyond society, and they are who they are.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that.
Okay. Well, bear in mind what I said at the beginning, that everybody has the capability of violence. I mean, that's why people, if you put them in an army, they become warriors. You know, you can train people. A lot of it is about stress. If I push you hard enough against the wall, there'll come a point where you'll get your fists out. And so a lot of abuse in relationships is of that type. The relationship is stressful for some reason.
Yeah.
And so the arguments stop being civilized and gradually become noisy, and then they start throwing the plates about, and then you start getting physical.
Yeah.
So that's one category of abuse, if you like. And while I'm not condoning it, it's the mildest because, in a way, it's relatively easy to deal with. So at the other extreme, you've got people who have got frank personality disorders or worse. Now, the problem with them is that it's intractable. You really can't change a personality disorder. People won't accept treatment. I mean, the problem with a personality disorder is that when I've got it, I think that's the way the world is, and I think you're weird and I'm okay.
Yeah.
So why would I accept treatment? To become like you, a weirdo. You know? And so if I've got one of the personality disorders that makes me abusive, the chances of that being changed in a relationship are very low. So at one extreme you've got violence or abuse caused by stress, that can be fixed. The other extreme you've got caused by frank mental illness or personality disorder, enormously difficult to deal with.
Yeah.
And then in the middle, you've got all sorts of learned behaviors and things of that sort, you know. Now, some personality disorders arise in childhood. On the other hand, some childhoods are very unpleasant, but you don't have a personality disorder, but you've learned to behave in a very weird way. And so you will get people, for example, who were abused as children, and then they go out and perhaps look for abusers.
Right.
So they actually search for them. They look for people like what they were familiar with when they were children. Or you get the reverse. You get people who have learned to be abusers, and so they go out and find victims.
Yeah.
You see the spectrum that exists.
Completely. And I can't help but think about traditional African society and many communities. You'll find a woman gets married and she stays with this man and he beats her. And when he stops beating her, she'll say, he doesn't love me anymore because this is a sign of love. This is, you know, my dad did this to my mother and he did this to me before and now somebody else is getting the fists. Someone else is the love of his life. And you think, what?
Yes, quite. I mean, obviously, I don't feel too comfortable with stories like that, but you're quite right. They do occur.
All right, talking about the children, because now we're right there in that environment where it could be the environment that shapes the mind of this child to become a perpetrator or a victim. I can't help but think of women and men who choose to stay in situations that are not safe. And the excuse most people will give is the children. My children need their father. My children need this woman as a mother. Staying for the children. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Okay. People say that, but in practice it's not true. It's not the reason they're staying. There are lots of ways people can leave an abusive relationship, but they all have the same common factor, which is that you have to prepare to do it. You can't just suddenly decide one morning that you're going to walk out. Often that does happen. You know, somebody gets beaten up the night before, they don't go home from casualty, they go and see their mum, and you think they've left, and yet another day later they've gone back home. And the reason is because they hadn't gone through the process of preparing to leave. Now, if somebody is taken through that process, if they're helped to imagine the world after the end of the relationship, everything from where am I going to live, I've got to get a job, what am I going to tell my family, how am I going to manage the children. As you work on all those things and you talk to a lawyer and you talk to all the people who are going to be involved, there comes a day when you realize, actually I can do this, I can leave. And then people do. And of course, what they do is they don't have a big row and leave, they just quietly go. As a matter of fact, it's worth a little sort of sidestep to say that somebody who's in abusive relationship has to imagine the bug-out situation. You know, an awful lot of abusers work through what's called a cycle of abuse. In other words, we have a terrifying row, and then next morning we're all terribly sweet and apologetic, and everything's lovely, and you think, oh, okay, this time it's all right. But then gradually the tension rises again, and it's quite obvious this is going to happen again.
It's building up,
Now, nobody should stick around in a house when it's quite obvious there's going to be an explosion that night. So the victim should always play the bug-out scenario to themselves, work out what they're going to do. So they need to think about, where can I go? It could be a relative, it could be a friend, it could be a cheap hotel. They need to prepare a little bag, the bug out bag, you know, with the documents and the keys and a little bit of money and one or two things for the children. And when the temperature starts to show the first signs of rising, they need to make an excuse. I just need to go to the loo.
And they've gone.
And they've gone.
Right.
Because if you don't do that, you might end up in casualty.
Continue with this story in part 2.